Alright, yes, we're live. Cool, sounds good. So, yeah, we just had a storm just now, so I was a little bit concerned of how that might affect the connection, but it didn't. So, yeah, I'm just going to move the camera down just a little bit. There you go. Alright, cool. So, as you can see, I am dressed a little bit differently this week for this week's live stream. I'm going to wait a little bit because I know sometimes it takes a couple minutes for Facebook to send out the notification about you being live and all that stuff. So, but this week I am dressed in one of my 18th century outfits. And I was going to do this last week because last week I started discussing a bit of why, how and why I got started in living history. And that, unfortunately, me dressing up ended up not happening just because of how the day fell. But this week, I actually decided this week it would be a little bit more befitting, simply because I'm going to do a little bit more of a deep dive as to why exactly I continue to do living history and why it continues to influence the kind of music as well as the kind of stories that I write. First, I want to give a little shout out to Christine Scanlon of Romantically Bent. I bought this neckerchief, I don't know how well you can see that, I bought this neckerchief from her at an 18th century event out in Lewisburg. It was their 18th century artisan show put on by Friends of Fort Frederick. And she was there. She sells really beautiful 18th century clothing, so if you're into period clothing, she's somebody to buy from. I'll leave a link in the description. But I bought this neckerchief hoping I'd get to wear it to some events this year. So far, that's not happened, although with some places moving into the green, maybe some things will happen, just maybe on a smaller scale. But I'm wearing it for the first time this year, so yes, but I'll put Romantically Bent's link in the description, even if you're not into period clothing. Just, you know, just kind of go browse, check out what she has. So, I'm Tiffany, for those that might be brand new to my page. If you are, welcome. And like I said, a couple of you are just joining us now, so like I said, going to be delving a little bit deeper into my adventures in living history and why exactly I continue to do it, and why, you know, it influences so much of my stories and music. So I do have kind of a cheat sheet here, notes. Usually I like to kind of just talk on these things, but for this I really just kind of had to organize my thoughts, just because it does get pretty deep, especially if you're somebody that does do a lot of historical research like I do, and you're constantly learning. In fact, I have a very befitting quote here that I posted to my page. Let me find it. That I posted to my page as well, my Facebook page, as well as to my Instagram earlier. So yeah, just bear with me while I scroll. Okay, yes, so shout out to Kevin Henry for posting this on his Facebook page. I shared it, and then I also uploaded it to my Instagram as well as my Tumblr, Twitter, all those pages. But it says, "You must always be willing to truly consider evidence that contradicts your beliefs and admit the possibility that you may be wrong. Intelligence isn't knowing everything. It's the ability to challenge everything you know." And, you know, thank you, Kevin, for posting that. That was, you know, and I shared that for many reasons, because that is how I approach my research. Whether I'm doing research for a living history event, whether I'm doing research for a book, or I'm doing research for a song, you know, that has very strong historical roots to it, or if I'm interpreting a traditional piece. I know a couple weeks ago I did a traditional, I did like a couple of, I shared with you some of my research for a couple of traditional songs that I am going to be doing on my new upcoming album. And it's, the John Barleycorn Must Die and Help to the Company. So even when I'm interpreting a song like that, be it for my own work or my work with Wayward Companions, that is really how I like to approach any type of research that I do. And I'll say it again for those that are just joining us, you basically have to always be willing to really consider, that, hey, you might be wrong. Yes, you might, have some information, but you might not have the whole picture. Okay, and the more, and going off of that, the more that I tend to delve into living history, the more, and it really is true, the more you learn, the more you realize just how little you know. It's almost like the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. So, and that couldn't be more true. When I'm doing, researching something for a talk that I am to give, or like I said, a story or a song, and I'm always uncovering some new piece of information. When I go to a living history event, I'm talking to people. I'm always learning something new, or I'm learning something that maybe I already knew, but it's being expanded upon. And one thing, if I may be bold, I do think that there is a big problem with how history is generally taught. Okay? I think many people, and this is from my experience as a living historian, from talking to the public, from doing many events, and whether I'm portraying a civilian in 18th century life, or lately I've been dabbling a little in 19th century. I've been doing a little bit of Edwardian here and there, World War I. In talking to people, I've found that, well, you get a mix of people, but one thing that I have found that a lot of people do tend to have in common, and in my experience, is that they tend to come into this thinking that they, like they know. In other words, they have these preconceived notions. And later on, I am going to get into a little bit of the clothing and everything, because let me tell you, if I had $1 for every time, I heard I had somebody come up to me when I'm dressed like this saying, wow, you must be really uncomfortable, or, I've had people tell me, things like, oh, especially like if I'm doing a music gig, I've had people tell me, things like, how can you possibly sing in that, especially if I'm doing a more operatic piece, especially if I'm wearing Victorian clothing, Oh, hey, thank you. All right, especially if I'm wearing Victorian clothing and a Victorian corset. I've had people ask me, well, how can you possibly sing in that? Aren't you uncomfortable? And all that, this, that, and the other. And I will get into a little bit of that later, because like I said, and I'm sure many, many living historians out there, those are, people that do this sort of thing, especially the women, can probably relate, and I'm sure the men, the men can too. And that's one reason why I am doing research and, on, developing a male persona and doing an 18th century French soldier's impression. Because I want to learn that side of things, because, I want to be able to really paint as broad a picture as I can for people. And I think that's where a lot of teaching history goes wrong. We're not getting the broader picture. And one thing that I have noticed is that, especially in recent years, is that people tend to either overly romanticize or overly demonize history. I'll say that again. They tend to either overly romanticize or overly demonize, and it's usually either one or the other, very compartmentalized. And honestly, I think that does such a great disservice. And, you know, to me, I appreciate those historians that do make the effort to paint the larger picture. In the very first episode that I did of Inside the Labyrinth, my podcast, I gave the little analogy of walking into a dark room where there's a massive wall painting, and all you have to see that wall painting is a flashlight. Okay, so you're shining that little flashlight, trying to, like, you know, piece together this massive wall painting. Okay? But it's not until you completely turn on the light that you can see what the painting actually is. I mean, in the dark with the flashlight, you can maybe try to piecemeal things and maybe try to make out what you think it is and maybe try to interpret what you think it might be, but it's not until you turn on the light and see the whole picture. And that is where you will really start to just really develop an understanding for that painting, the history behind the painting, and just the painting in general. You'll really start to understand it, see what it is, see it for what it is, and maybe learn a little something from it. And you know, and when I focus on history, I tend to focus a lot on, you know, I do, and you know, as I've mentioned before, I tend to do a lot with, you know, cosmetics, clothing, music. Those are, you know, and dance as well, 18th century and 19th century dance. You know, those are some of my passions. But I also have tend to do a lot with. I love women's history, and because I'm a woman, you know, that's what I can relate to. I do like a lot of women's history. I do think that a lot of it is very underrepresented, and a lot of it is our own fault. And I know a lot of people probably don't want to hear that. I know I might lose some people over that, but a lot of it is our own fault, because the way I see it, you know, we're eventually, at the end of the day, responsible for having our stories told. You know, we shouldn't be waiting around for someone else to do it. We need to be out there doing the research and telling the stories, and make sure that, you know, the great ladies as well as the great men, you know, everybody, everyone that came before us are getting the proper recognition, you know. And probably a year or two ago, my friend and wayward companion bandmate, Laura Mason Lockhart, and I, we did a presentation on women in history at the John Neville House at the museum. And hold on, I totally forgot to, when I was doing the shout-outs at the beginning, shout out to Christine Scanlon of Romantically, and shout out to Amanda Lipp of Common Ground Pottery. She made this beautiful piece. This is actually inspired by a design that was quite popular in the 17th century in Jamestown. And yes, and this is my little period mug for this week. So cheers, Amanda Lipp. Beautiful job. I love this mug. So now I need a sip of water anyway too. Sorry, this is turning into kind of a PSA as opposed to a fun live stream, but you know, sometimes these things do need to be talked about. And yes, I will be delving a lot more into this stuff in my podcast too. So about a year or two ago, Laura Mason Lockhart and I, we did a presentation on women in the 18th century, and the women that we covered was everything from the camp followers to, you know, the camp followers that would follow, you know, the military, and, you know, and I do portray a camp follower from time to time in my French unit. The camp followers would follow the soldiers, for those that are unfamiliar with that term, and what they would do is they were usually married to a soldier. Actually, they were pretty much always married to a soldier, and they would, you know, do jobs like launder and, you know, sew and, you know, tend to the sick and just do like everything that needed to be done for the war effort. And this was both on the colonist side as well as the British Loyalist side. Both sides had that. The French and, you know, French and Indian War or 7-Year War, they had that too. British and the French, and, you know, and women have been contributing to war efforts, you know, for centuries. A lot of people tend to think that, you know, that just started with World War II, and it did not. And, you know, and I have so much respect for the women that worked in the factories in World War II. In fact, 2 of my great aunts, they kind of led double lives. They were pinup models and they were working in the factories. So, and there we have some like wonderful pictures of them with their, you know, their hair in the, you know, their hair up, and their, you know, they're drilling and making the warships and the planes and everything. There are photos that we do have of a couple of my great aunts, you know, participating in that. And, you know, and I think that that is so amazing that I have women in my family that, you know, really that were involved with that. I just think that that's so awesome. But it wasn't the first time that women have, you know, been doing that. All throughout the centuries, you know, if they weren't, you know, camp followers and, you know, contributing to the war efforts that way, they were staying at home and taking over their husbands' businesses. And this was the case during the War of Independence as well as Civil War, World War I. I mean, you name it, it happened. And and even the high-ranking officers' wives were doing their part. They weren't just, you know, sitting pretty. They were doing their parts to really keep up the morale and, you know, just keep everything going and running, and, you know, making sure that, you know, the soldiers were given what they needed to be able to fight, you know, to be able to go into battle and, you know, fight. They, you know, making sure that they had what they needed. And so Laura and I covered that. We also covered the first female postmaster, who was, her name was Mary Catherine Bedard. Look her up. Her story is really, really cool. And she was the first female postmaster. She was here in the 18th century. She was a publisher. She was a printer, writer, and a postmaster. And she was a pretty amazing woman. And one thing about her was that she was also the second printer to draft do a printing of the Declaration of Independence, which is really awesome. And when I mentioned Mary Catherine Bedard to the group of mostly women that Laura and I were doing the presentation for, nobody in the audience, nobody attending knew who she was when I mentioned her name. In fact, I even said, okay, who here knows who Mary Catherine Bedard is? And they were like, everybody was like, I don't know, and there's no shame in not knowing, but, kind of like in the saying that Kevin posted and then I posted, intelligence isn't knowing everything, it's the ability to challenge everything you know. And, because there's things that I still don't know that I'm going to be probably learning. There's things that I think I know that, hey, maybe some new information will come up and I'll be like, okay, I might need to alter my belief on that. But, like I said, Mary Catherine Bedard was, and people are shocked, like, oh, how could she as a woman have been able to do that? And I thought, and I have heard this several times, as have a few of my friends and acquaintances in the living history world. We always hear, I thought women weren't allowed to work. Women did work. So, and I'm not saying that everything was great for them. I'm not saying that there weren't some injustices, but women did hold down jobs. There were single and widowed women that owned their own businesses. There were, married women that assisted their husbands with the family business. And, and if something were to happen to the husband where he wasn't able to perform running his business, whether that was illness, injury, death, or even maybe, hey, going out of town on on like a business trip, the wife would 9 times out of 10 be taking over the business. And I brought up several times. I brought up, not just in the presentation that Laura and I did, I've brought up several times women as blacksmiths. And I have been in the blacksmith shop at a couple living history sites, I will go on record to say I'm not a great blacksmith. In fact, I know the basics, I know the fundamentals, thanks to Andy, the awesome person who taught me. But if it came down to it, I would rather sew than smith. However, I did like the couple times that I have been that I was in the blacksmith shop, because it got a good conversation going. I was able to tell people, yes, women would have been it was not unusual for a woman to be in the blacksmith shop. And once again, people would usually be surprised. One thing though I will note, and I kind of thought this was interesting, when I would talk about things like, women as blacksmiths and printers and, and other tavern owners and things like that, the age group that was the least surprised to hear things like that were the the more elderly people, and I'm talking 80 years old and over. They were the least surprised to hear about, yes, women were indeed blacksmiths. Yes, women did print and own printing presses and, things like that. They were the least surprised. However, when you got, younger, especially when you're getting into like the younger baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, etc., and so on, they're usually absolutely shocked. And I don't know about anybody else out there, but this has been my experience. But it's usually the the younger ages that are usually very shocked, and they've never heard that. And I thought that that's just an observation that I've made over like the 4, 5, 6 years that I've been doing this. And what it tells me is that there's obviously like an information gap somewhere where, at one point, as the generations got younger, somehow things just kind of like, certain facts just kind of got pushed to the wayside, and which I found interesting. I'm not going to pretend I know why, but that was just like an observation that I made. But I do like sometimes, just taking on things like, being in a blacksmith shop, or, doing something that would have been, that maybe people might look at as being more like traditionally masculine. Because it does, like I said, it does get a very good conversation going. And, and I like it when people can walk away really learning something. And I also really like it when people can walk away having maybe a long-held belief that they have challenged a little bit. Laura and I, we also covered some of the actresses of the day. We also covered some opera singers. In fact, I'm doing some research on a couple of 18th and 19th century opera singers that I would love to maybe portray at some events. But yes, we went through a lot of the occupations that women held. And at the end of it, you know, people, I mean, like they loved the presentation. Like this one woman came up to us and like she was on fire. She was like, you know, like I'm gonna go, because she was an elementary school teacher, and she was saying, I'm gonna go, like, you know, teach the lives of these women to my students. And I mean, I'm like, good, please do, you know, because, you know, it needs to be told, and people need to get a broad picture of what's going on instead of just this compartmentalized view of things. And one other person that is very good about doing this is Eliza of Silk and Sass, 1776. That's the name of her blog. I came across her blog, actually. I was doing some research on women's history, and as well as stays and corsets, which we'll get into that too, because that's one of the biggest fashion lies ever. Yeah, and I believe that's how I stumbled across her blog. And thank you very much. So, what's up? And that's how I stumbled across her blog. And so when I stumbled across her blog and I started reading, just reading through things and just reading about how she and I basically share the same, you know, the same views of, you know, how history should be taught. Like, you know, I was just like, oh, I mean, there's a lot of great blogs out there, you know, don't get me wrong, but with hers, I really, really resonated, because what she does is she kind of does what I do. She busts history myths, which I'm all for a good history myth, you know, busting a good history myth. So I'm all for that, because there's way too many out there masquerading as truth. Or sometimes there's myths where there's like a kernel of truth in it, but it's just gotten embellished over the years. But I'm all for just completely taking those and just ripping them apart. She does that, and is brilliant about it. And also, she also delves into the crevices of history that not too many people know about. In fact, when she does portray living history and does do reenactment events, and she and her husband, they have a music group as well, and that's where I also kind of resonated with her too, because I also do living early music with Wayward Companions. She and her husband, they have their own thing going, and I mean, in our musical acts, we do have a slightly different approach, but overall, I mean, you know, it's early music. But she also talks a good deal about some of the more unknown parts of history. And she's also stressed many, many times that people need to have a larger picture of what was going on. And when she does do living history events and she's portraying a person, you know, a woman of history, she tends to actually, instead of portraying a colonist, she tends to portray a British loyalist. And I was reading one of her blog posts about, you know, the British loyalist camp followers, as well as the officers' wives that were also doing their part, and you know, those were on both sides of the aisle. But somebody asked her, so why do you usually portray a British loyalist? And she even said, well, because all parts of history needs to be discussed in order for people to really get a good picture of the broadest picture possible of what was going on. And you know, she has also done things like talk about even, you know, mediums and cartomancy, which is, you know, like the reading of cards. You know, when you're, you know, if you're like being a psychic medium in the 18th century, and you know what that was like, and during the American Enlightenment, it was stuff like that, because people usually have this preconceived notion that everybody was religious, everybody, you know, just had the same set of beliefs. And one of my biggest pet peeves of history and how people view it, is the notion that everybody was just this ginormous hive mind, you know, and people were, you know, they didn't have any original thought. Maybe you had a couple here and there, but, you know, everybody just kind of believed and thought the same and all held the same values, and that's absolutely not true. Everybody, you know, people were, I mean, I think in my last, in last week's live stream, I mentioned Jace Townsend and how he said that it wasn't, it wasn't uncommon for people who maybe only lived 5 miles apart from each other, or 5 minutes from each other even, they might have a completely different set of beliefs, values, you know, how they view the world, how they view other people, other cultures. They would have had a, you know, might have had a completely different mindset. And, you know, and it's just, and I think you're also, you know, it's also a disservice to make generalizations. And, because, and one thing I was talking about with another one of my living history friends, actually a couple of them, we can kind of agree that at least most of us, we tend to hate averages because, you know, what might have been, you know, one person's set of beliefs in reality wasn't necessarily another person's set of beliefs in reality. And another thing that Eliza goes into that I really like, and by the way, I'll link to her blog below. She's appeared on my blog a couple times. I've appeared on her blog. We've done blog swaps, and she's a cool girl. She's a cool girl. So yeah, give her a follow definitely. But another one that I really like that she does is she also does a portrayal of, she kind of steps outside the 18th century a bit, and also does a portrayal of the silent films, of the film star Theda Bara, and which I was just like, you know, and when she does World War I, she's done a couple of World War I events where she's portrayed Theda. And people are like, well, why would you portray an actress at a World War I event where everybody's either portraying a soldier or an army nurse or, you know, just something to do with the military? Well, because Theda actually played, you know, she was very much involved with the war effort too. In fact, a lot of actors and actresses in Hollywood were doing some, you know, war propaganda films and, you know, things like that. Whereas with Theda, she had a very vampy look, a very kind of dark, sultry way about her. So a lot of those war films were going to actresses that had a more kind of wholesome image. So Theda took it upon herself to actually go on, you know, like kind of tour different military bases, you know, talk to the soldiers, you know, talk to the wounded. She even got involved in the war bond business and everything, and she received a presidential honor for her work. And that's not really something you hear about. I mean, even there's this one podcast that I listen to, and I do enjoy it, and they did do an episode on Theda, but they made absolutely no mention of her efforts in the First World War or her presidential honor. And this is also a podcast that, you know, comes off as very like kind of pro-woman and everything. And I was kind of disappointed because I was hoping for sure that they would delve into that in the same way that Eliza does on her blog. But they didn't, and I was just like, okay, like they just basically covered her film career and how, compared to her vampy on-screen image, she basically led a milk white toast life, and I'm just like, or as those were their words, like a milk white toast life, and I'm just like, well, I feel like I can kind of go anywhere to any film history site and read about her film career. I want to know what she did in World War I, you know? So, yeah, so just things like that, that Eliza tends to delve into, that, I'm just like, she's actually led me to some information that I didn't know. And, so she's one person that I really like, whose work I really appreciate. So Eliza, thank you, girl. All right, and another one, and this is where I get into the corsets, okay, or the stays. The proper 18th century term is stays, and then into the Victorian era, it was, that's when corsets became more mainstay, the term. But sometimes I'll just say corsets just because not meant, when you say stays, people are usually like, so sometimes I'll just say corset just to alleviate some confusion, but not after, before I'll say, stays were actually the proper term. But I came across this book, and once again, in my research on corsets and stays, and just women's undergarments in general, Sarah A. Chrisman, her book, Victorian Secrets, What a Corset Taught Me About the Past, Present, and Myself. And this is an awesome book, and she got a lot of her research on a book that Valerie Steele wrote on the cultural history of corsets, and also several other women in the living history world have also done videos and blogs on, Eliza has too, on corsets, and what is actually the biggest fashion lie in history, because I'm sure you've heard all of the horrible things about corsets. In fact, I'm wearing a pair of 18th century stays right now, and I'm talking to you just fine. I don't feel faint. I have sung in not only 18th century stays, but also a Victorian era corset. I have sang, I've danced, I've done blacksmithing, sewing, I've done hearth cooking, I've done all sorts of activities in my stays. And what she gets into, and I really like her story, and I am going to do when my podcast kind of relaunches, I am going to do a full-on episode on the history of corsets, and also with myself, Laura, Kara, and Sally, we're going to be doing an evolution of corsets presentation at the John Neville House. We're supposed to do it at the end of August. And what we're going to do is basically show you how the corsets changed throughout history, because many people are under the misconception that all corsets are the same. Well, no, they're not. And I'll also be delving into, and Sarah Chrisman also delves into this, if corsets really aren't that bad, then also why have so many Hollywood actresses, everyone from like Emma Stone to Keira Knightley to, even back in the 1930s, Vivian Leigh, when she was in her role of Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind, complaining about how uncomfortable their corsets were, how they could only have their meals liquid because their corset was so tight and uncomfortable. Well, a lot of that has to do with the fact that so basically, I'm just going to give you a little crash course and save the rest for my podcast episode. If your corset is uncomfortable and hurts, it could be one of two things: either it's not properly fitted, or you haven't worn it enough. And the thing about costuming, and also as somebody who has worked in theater and film, and and even and still does some of that too, I can honestly say that costumes are usually, I don't want to say hurriedly done, but they're only done to fit the actress's very basic measurements, whereas for a pair of corsets and stays, like a very properly fitting pair of corsets or stays, that is actually going to serve you know, the woman well and acting as a back brace and acting as just pretty much like, you know, a back brace, as well as making sure that your clothes fit properly. That is, of course, I have to be getting text messages while I'm doing a live stream. All right. But, okay, so yeah, where did my poor little mind go? Okay, so, you know, but really that's what, you know, what corsets are supposed to be, a back brace, as well as making sure your clothes are fitting properly and that they're, you know, also falling evenly on you as well, and you know, and keeping your frame steady. I mean, corsets and stays do have that great use. And a lot of the time when you're doing like a piece of theatrical clothing, sometimes you're not always taking like the woman's, like the actress's, you know, kind of unique body shape in mind. You know, you're doing, okay, these are their measurements. Okay, we're just going to construct this really quick. So that's one reason why, like, say if you're on a film, you know, and you have to wear, you know, corset, you know, things like that. That could be part of why, you know, some of them were quite uncomfortable. And you know, so and it's also been my experience too, like if somebody's brand new to living history, and you know, I even had someone recently, you know, have, you know, a pair of Regency era stays, and she couldn't raise her arms, and she thought that was normal because she had heard all of these really terrible things about corsets. And those of us that have been doing this, like, we were like, no, you should be able to like raise your arms. You should be able to function just as you would as if you weren't even wearing one. And so we were able to get her properly fitted, and like she was like, oh, I feel so much better. And women that I have observed that do get a pair of stays or a corset that's specifically tailored to their body type, they said it just makes a world of difference. And even, you know, their backs feel better, and etc. and so on. So, I mean, there's so many nuances. I mean, just with pretty much anything with history, there's so many nuances. There's so many different, you know, things, you know, to get into with corsets. But another interesting, before I move on, another interesting fact is that a lot of the times, corsets and stays were actually made for women by women. So there's something to keep in mind, and there's something that's pretty contradicting to, you know, to what you usually hear. But yeah, but that is my little live stream for this evening. I hope you enjoyed it. And yes, and next week I will be spilling some tea on some history myths, as well as giving you a little music update as well. So I'm, you know, really excited about how things are going, and thank you so much for tuning in. And I'm really looking forward to, you know, launching this podcast and just talking about these subjects. And, you know, and also, I mean, I could even do, you know, full episodes on, you know, each of like some of these women, like Charlotte Brown, for instance, who was a camp follower in General Braddock's army, and she was an amazing woman. In fact, a friend of mine, Dr. Erica Knuckles, who's the director at Fort Ligonier, when she was getting her PhD, she did her dissertation on Charlotte Brown. So yeah, so I mean, I might, who knows, pick her brain, have her on. I don't know. I mean, we'll see. But yes, but I, you know, do look forward to delving into more of this in the podcast, and maybe doing some write-ups for the blog for it. And like I said, next week it'll be all about a couple of history myths and some music updates. So, and yeah, so thank you very much for joining me, and I hope to see you next week. Hope you have a great weekend, and I will, all right, see you then. All right, bye, take care, and have a lovely night.